May I just ask you for a second, just a few words on the very last program parts of this third Forum of Sociology of the International Sociological Association. In a minute, at 5:45, the closing plenary will start, entitled Global Sociology and the Struggles for a Better World. As was the opening plenary, the closing plenary will also be hosted by the ISA Vice President for Research, Markus. The plenary will have subtitles, and the speeches that are without subtitles are on the request of the speakers, but you will see that. The closing plenary ends at 7:15, and immediately after the closing plenary there will be two goodbye addresses, one by Margaret Abraham, the President of the International Sociological Association, and the second by Rudolf Richter, the President of the Local Organizing Committee. After 5 days full of talks, discussion, ideas and intellectual stimulation, we then move on to our last official program point, the farewell party. So food and drinks are all prepared. There will be music, a wine presentation and surprise acts on different floors. Hopefully all of you will experience the particular Viennese Gemütlichkeit that already had been addressed by the band at the opening ceremony. The farewell party will start at 7:30 in the exhibition area, the main ceremonial chamber of the University of Vienna. It's on the first floor. You might have seen the exhibitions there. The weather did not allow to have the party in the arcaded courtyard, but there will be different places, you will see. So enjoy the closing plenary and the last bits of the third forum of sociology. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Ulrike. And welcome to the closing plenary on the futures we want, global sociology and the struggles for a better world. It is my enormous pleasure to introduce to you the distinguished speakers. They come from different world regions: Asef Bayat, PORIO, Akosua, ADOMAKO, AMPOFO, Todd, GITLIN, and our commentator, Alain, TOURAINE. But before, let me make a quick announcement, because there was a lot of interest in the texts of the Spanish speaking presenter from the opening plenary, Nora Garita. That text will be available by next week in both its Spanish original and in the English translation on the web forum at http://futureswewant.net. I think you can also show that slide, so you have the URL where you can find it. Our first speaker tonight is Asef Bayat. Asef Bayat is currently the Catherine and Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies and Professor of Sociology and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Bayat had previously taught for many, many years at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and had served as the director of the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World at Leiden University in the Netherlands, while also holding visiting positions at the universities of California at Berkeley, Columbia, Oxford, and Brown. Dr. Bayat was awarded fellowships by the Ford, Guggenheim, MacArthur, and the Open Society Foundations. Among Asef Bayat's most recent books are Post-Islamism, The Changing Faces of Political Islam, with Oxford University Press, and Life as Politics, How Ordinary People Change the Middle East, with Stanford University Press in its second edition. The title of his talk is Imagining Muslim Democracy. Let us welcome Asef Bayat.
Thank you very much, Markus, and thank you all for coming. It is a pleasure to be here in the company of my distinguished panelists. The question that I would like to address in this session is, can there be a Muslim democracy? I'm posing this question because in the past couple of decades there has been an enormous discussion, debate about whether or not Islam is compatible with democracy. Now, of course, this has been instigated by, a lot of developments in the Muslim world and also in Europe, the rise of radicalism, ISIS, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that within this atmosphere, the answer to that question often in the mainstream media is a no. The critiques basically argue that, look at what is happening in the Muslim world, in Iran, look at there, or in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so on. You don't really see much of a democracy, especially when you look at groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on and so forth. Others refer to sort of the canons, to certain philosophical underpinning of Islam, saying that in Islam, sovereignty does not belong to people, it belongs to God. So therefore, the model of governance would be largely theocracy rather than autocracy. Or the views of the texts in Islam, Quran or Hadith, on women or on violence, basically is something that which pretty away from the kind of liberal democracy that we see, for instance, in the Western world. Here, in this discussion, I don't intend to enter into a philosophical debate on the question of whether or not Islam is compatible with democracy or not, because I do believe that the issue really is not philosophical. It is largely political. In fact, as a sociologist, I really do not study Islam. I study Muslims. My preoccupation is not faith, but it is the faithful, which, of course, the faithful and Muslims, of course, deal with their own texts, right? But in a very differentiated, sometimes even contradictory fashion. I would basically argue that Islam itself is a site of very intense struggle within itself. That some parts of Muslims basically have projected Islam as being pretty in animosity against democracy. Others, however, they have tried to make their Islam compatible with democracy. In fact, I did a book, and it's called Making Islam Democratic. So we make democratic, we make undemocratic. In the experiences that we have had in the past, for instance, through decades, there are two trends that actually represent this somewhat contradictory tendencies, Islamism and post-Islamism. I would argue that Islamism actually is not democratic, it's pretty undemocratic, but post-Islamism can be, and I think, and is. But what do I mean by all this? By Islamism, I mean those ideologies and movements that want to establish some kind of an Islamic order, a religious state, Sharia law, and some kind of moral codes in Muslim societies and communities. For Islamists, association with the state is a must. I think Islamists are very interested in seizing the state power, not only because it ensures and reproduces their rule, but because they see the state as the most efficient institution through which they can enforce the Quranic dictum, Amr al-Ma'ruf wa Nahy al-Munkar, or command good and forbid wrong. One can debate a lot about what it means and so on in the sort of tradition of Islamic, but tradition of Muslims, but I don't have time to this. But because they are doing this, the Islamist normative and legal perspective places more emphasis on people's obligations, their takalif, as they say, rather than their rights. And people are perceived more as dutiful subjects rather than rightful citizens. So Islamism, to me, is basically a duty-centered religious polity. Examples include, Iran's hardliners, or Muslim Brothers in Egypt, or Jamaat Islamiyya in Pakistan, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and many other groups, and so on. But Islamist movements, of course, vary as to how they achieve these objectives. They have experienced different trajectories. Some are reformists, like Muslim Brothers. They, try to form a party and take part, in elections and to win. But it's still the ultimate goal is, in fact, to Islamization of the state and society. Others are revolutionary and somewhat Leninist in the sense of wanting to seize the state power, sometimes often through violence, and then try to usher their Islamization from above. And then you have also jihadi trends, like the groups associated with Al-Qaeda, which is somewhat different. While I think militant Islamism represents a political movement that operates within a nation state and therefore targets the national states, most jihadis are transnational in their both ideas and operation, and often they represent apocalyptic sort of ethical movements, which involves in civilizational struggles and target a highly abstract, really, issues like the corrupt West or the societies of non-believers. And I think for many jihadis, the very struggle itself or jihad becomes an end in itself. Now, post-Islamism is different. On the one hand, to me, post-Islamism is a condition, and on the other hand, it is a project. It is a condition in the sense that, sort of following a phase of experimentation, the appeal, energy, and sources of legitimacy of Islamism gets exhausted even among their most ardent supporters. So after a trial and error through experimentation, they realize that it's not working. So therefore, they try to reinvent themselves. But that they reinvent themselves at the cost, in my view, of a qualitative change. And I think the tremendous transformation that really took place in Iran of 1990s somewhat represents this trend. Not only a condition, post-Islamism is also, more importantly, a project. It is a conscious attempt to conceptualize and strategize the rationale and modalities of transcending Islamism in social, political, and intellectual domain. In this sense, post-Islamism is neither un-Islamic, anti-Islamic, or secular. It is religious. But it is a critique of Islamism from within and from without. It is an endeavor to fuse religiosity with rights, faith and freedom, Islam and democracy. It is an attempt to turn the underlying principles of Islamism on its head by emphasizing rights rather than just duties, plurality in place of a singular sort of authoritative voice, historicity rather than fixed scriptures, not just text, but also interpretation, historical interpretation of text. And of course, they're also interested in the future rather than the so-called kind of golden past. It wants to marry Islam with democracy and modernity to achieve what some social scientists have termed as alternative modernity, where secular democratic state may coexist with religious or pious society. So they are interested in non-religious state, but they are interested in religious society. So non-religious secular state, but pious society. But now the question of how they sort of evolved into this trajectory, into this is very complex, and I don't have time in my book. I have explained looking at 10 countries and so on. But largely they derive from an Islamist past. But let me just make a few minor points and one major point, and then I end. First of all, I'm talking about post-Islamism, not post-Islamic. So, in other words, so these trends or these movements do not want to, do away with religion. They are still religious. They are still Muslims, but they are interested in a particular kind of polity. I also disagree with the view that post-Islamism, as some people have argued, it is just a variant of Islamism, but it has a different form. But the fact of the matter is that there's a qualitative difference. Because I do want in my investigation to look at the very critique and the trajectory of change, within the Islamist movement. So, in my view, AKP is very different from Milli Gurush. The examples of course, post-Islamism are reformist in Iran, at least for some years, AKP in Turkey, or Justice and Development Party also in Morocco. There is a PKS in Indonesia, or of course, recently a Nahda party in Tunisia. So these groups actually have emerged from Islamist past, and they are different from their own experiences, and a lot of them have criticized their own past. So it is not right to pull them together in one category as Islamism, because it is misleading. And also, I think we shouldn't confuse post-Islamism with electoral Islamism. The fact that, some Islamist groups like Muslim Brothers or Jamaat Islami in Pakistan are interested in participating in the political process does not necessarily make them post-Islamist. Even if, they are part of the process, and it is very important, and they are distinguished from the nonconformist or the militant ones who want to overthrow the system. But nevertheless, so long as they have the objective of creating an Islamic state and then ushering an Islamic society, then to me they remain Islamists. But the way in which they want to achieve, of course, is different. Some say that post-Islamism is the same as liberal Islam or Islamic liberalism. Now, if liberal Islam means an interpretation Islam that accommodates modern democracy, civil, non-religious state, freedom of thought, or human progress, certainly there are a lot of conversions between the two. But post-Islamism is more than simply what it projects. It is also about what it transcends. It is also a critique of something else, and that is, to me, analytically important and interesting. If a liberal Islam implies privatization of Islam, privatization of religion, then this is not what really post-Islamists are necessarily after or aspire, because post-Islamists still believe that religion should play an active role in public sphere. And if sort of liberal Islam is taken to signify an Islam that respects individual rights, then here comes challenge, individual rights and liberties. And here comes the challenge. Because the question here is how much the post-Islamist sensibilities and the fact that they want to create a pious society can accommodate individual rights and liberties. In other words, if shall we say, under a post-Islamist rule, a Muslim whatever he wants to, he or she wants to not fast and break his fast or her fast in public. So what the position of a post-Islamist towards him or her would be. I think there is still a lot of debate and discussion among the post-Islamists about the extent and the degree of individual liberties. When you look at sort of actual experiences, we have at least three, actual post-Islamist rule in Turkey under AKP, Tunisia under Nahda, and Iran under Khatami, for instance. And I think the result is pretty mixed bag. And perhaps, and Nahda has been number one to me. I mean, the most kind of tolerant and the most open in some way. But I do think that the clash is pretty likely. But still, I do think that the likely clash between the post-Islamist sensibilities and liberal values might settle in some kind of illiberal or at least less liberal democracy where electoral democracy, and that's very important, electoral democracy may go along with some variable restrictions on liberties. For instance, on gender equality, on intellectual and artistic production, on different types of lifestyle, and so on and so forth. But then, those of us who actually study history of democracy, we realize that this is not something new. In fact, this is part and parcel of the history of democracy in the Western world too. Democracy is not this much, or we don't know. Democracy is itself a process of a struggle of democrats to democratize democracy, right? So gay marriage, for instance, may be unthinkable, say, 50 years ago, but it is becoming something very normal. Look at also gender equality, actually, even in the United States and so on, 1970s have been very significant, very different from 1950s. So that means that if electoral democracy persists, if it is institutionalized and accepted, then it can open the space for debate over and the possibility to extend the scope of these very liberties. So in conclusion, I think that perhaps, yes, we can imagine the possibility of a Muslim democracy, and I'm actually 3 minutes even ahead. Thank you, I'm done.
Fantastic, Asef. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Akosua ADOMAKO AMPOFO. She is Professor of African and Gender Studies and the Director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Dr. ADOMAKO AMPOFO is the author of many articles on African studies, gender, and feminism. She's co-editor of important volumes on transatlantic feminism, women and gender studies in Africa and the diaspora, African feminist politics of knowledge, tensions, challenges, and possibilities, and of the book African Musicology. As an activist scholar, she is a member of and has worked with many organizations in Ghana and abroad. She has received numerous awards and grants, including Fulbright scholarships, Mellon Fellowship, the Sociologists for Women Society Feminist Activism Award. Dr. ADOMAKO AMPOFO is the founding vice president of the African Studies Association of Africa, an honorary fellow of the Human Science Research Council of South Africa, and a co-president of RC32, the ISA's Research Committee on Women and Society. The title of her talk is Black Lives Matter and Envisioning the Future of Africana Studies. Let us welcome Akosua ADOMAKO AMPOFO.
Good evening, everyone. And you will see that my title has changed somewhat from the program and from what Markus said to you. And it's not because I'm schizophrenic, I'm still okay. I'd like to express my thanks to the ISA board and to Markus SCHULZ in particular for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'd like to start my presentation by reading something from one of my senior colleagues who was at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana when I joined it. This is his experience when he got to Oxford to do his PhD, and it reads, "It was not until I got to Oxford a few years later that an incident at dinner in college enabled me to attach meaning and significance to a particular expression. Grace was said and food was served. I turned to a student next to me and asked him kindly to pass me a jug of water. Thanking him, I poured water for myself and sent the jug back. Then the gentleman turned to me and whispered in my ears, 'Here in Oxford, we do not do that. When you ask for water, as a matter of courtesy, you have to serve others before yourself.' Embarrassed, I asked why, and he said, 'To show consideration and kindness to others.' 'This is really wonderful,' I reacted, rather defensive. In my culture, before serving others, tradition demands that whoever is serving must taste what they are serving first. In fact, anything you give to others to consume, you must taste it first. Surprised, my friend asked why, and I said, so that if the food or water is by any chance poisoned, Instead of all those you are serving dying, only one person must die. This was also meant to ensure that no one serving food or drink or medicine to others would be tempted to poison them. My friend's response was immediate. This is wonderful. This puts greater value on the lives of others as against our own. And the author is George Penyin Hagan. I believe we all have visions for the future we want to inhabit. While our energies may not be consumed daily with the struggles for a better world, I believe that practicing our craft as sociologists means that inevitably we engage with things that have to do with a better world, whether in the classrooms, whether we're writing for newspapers, whether we are dealing with policymakers and whatever. Admittedly, in a world where some views are gains for one group and might be losses for others, not everyone has the same visions for Africa. In other words, that we and that better world do not necessarily coincide. However, as sociologists, we are acutely aware, I hope, that deepening global inequality means we are all at risk of finding ourselves living in that land of anomy, or what the Akans of Ghana refer to as the state of loss of personhood. The Shona people of Southern Africa are known to respond to the greeting, "How are you?" with the response, "I am well if you are well." This awareness of the interconnectedness of humans that requires a concerted effort to maintain equilibrium through fairness and justice is reflected in the sayings and practices of many cultures. This is not unique to the Shona, of course. And I refer to almost universal notions among African communities of individual and corporate well-being, popularized today in the notion of Ubuntu, a Zulu word that means "I am because you are." And that encapsulates the view that our inherent individual humanness can only be experienced and expressed through acknowledgement of our shared humanness. These constructs set the parameters of well-being within contexts that are mutually binding. And I suggest that a return to them would benefit not only the academy, but all our futures. Sankofa is an Akan word that literally means return and get it. Sankofa is epitomized by the Asante Adinkra symbol, the one that you see on the bottom there, with a bird that has its beak reaching backwards to pick an egg off its back. It is often associated with a proverb which translated means something to the effect, "Nothing is lost if you go back and fetch what you have forgotten or left behind." While this symbol has often been used recently in some kind of a cultural revivalist sort of way, we can also think of Sankofa as the important project of seeking, understanding, revitalizing, and acknowledging knowledge that can build us all up. So as I continue, some disclaimers. Though I make some generalizations, I'm not here by any means seeking to essentialize, other, be reductionist, romanticize, or imply any pure or authentic, unchanging African knowledge system that I'm calling us to return to. I also use the terms African, Africana, or Black lives interchangeably and deliberately to signify the shared belongingness in terms of culture, history, and identity of people on the African continent and in her diaspora. That retains a certain salience given not only our history, but contemporary geopolitics. Indeed, in some contexts, the term Black has even been used to name a nationality. Because time may not permit me to cover all that I would like to say, let me start with my conclusions. A, knowledge hierarchies and the exclusions and silences in the academy, including sociology, are not innocent when it comes to the marginalized status of African people. 2, the mainstreaming of indigenous knowledge, and let me take a sidestep here to acknowledge that for our purposes, today I'm looking at African knowledge, and also to underscore, as my colleague Bandana Purkaista noted in this conference, that the notion of indigenous knowledge is obviously not unproblematic, and it presents these false binaries between tradition and modernity and so on. But indigenous knowledge, and I'll be doing a lot of these parenthesizing because, as we know, a lot of the concepts that we use are problematic and ambiguous. Indigenous knowledge, if we paid attention to it, would lead us to ask different questions, use different methodologies, in some cases come to different conclusions, and we might implement different kinds of policy. Number 3, sociology occurs outside the hallowed halls of the academy. We need to recognize this. or at least admit to it. And these sociological works, whether photography or music, especially youth new media, need to find a greater welcome and value in the academy. In the rest of this presentation, I do the following. One, point to the relationship between the knowledge industry and the status of Africana lives today. And I'll use this by referencing the Black Lives Movement and the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and two particular concepts within development, one in family planning and the other in the notion of democracy. I'll then go on to explain what I understand by an African-centered approach to knowledge production, and here I'll rely on examples from Akan traditions, and then I'll conclude, if I have enough time, but you already have my conclusions, by suggesting what an African-centered approach might look like. So the knowledge industry and African lives, and of course it is an industry, and I'm assuming that that needs no explanation. The theoretical paradigms and concepts we rely on are not unrelated to our contexts and standpoints. It matters what we privilege and what we exclude, the questions we ask and how we ask them, and who we ask them of, and how we interpret them and present them. In other words, what is considered as accepted sociological method, and the silences and the language. The academy, both on the continent and in the global north, privileges non-African voices and Euro-centered knowledge. This we know. And methods. In a heartfelt piece titled Sarah Bartman, Invisible, Pius Adesami, a Nigerian scholar of literature and French, produces a fictitious letter written by Sarah Bartman to Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guba, who produced the 2007 Norton Anthology of Literature by Women. Sarah Bartman, for those of you who might not know, was the most famous of at least two Khoikhoi women who were exhibited as curiosities in the 19th century in Europe under the now discredited name Hottentot Venus. African feminists have used her story to draw attention to the double burdens of sexism and racism endured by Black women. In his piece, Adesami, via Bartman, who's long dead and is complaining through the voice of Adesami, she laments, quote, the excision of African theories and theorists from this 2,452-page, two-volume collection. Reflections on and critiques of such erasures have been described by some scholars in the academy as protest literature from those of us on the continent, and that we are whinging and whining because our work doesn't get the same space that other works does. The reality is that the status of African lives, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, cannot be divorced from what is valorized as knowledge and influences policy as well as popular culture. As pointed out on Tuesday's common session by Rhoda Reddock, the ISA's own list of books, 100 best books of the century, is telling. Following her talk, I went hunting for some of the Black sociologists who, as far as I'm concerned, have made major contributions to sociology. So I looked for Pat Hill Collins' work on Black feminist thought, and it was not on the list. Admittedly, the list is very thin on works by feminist scholars, sociologists in general. Whereas Max Weber appears 14 times, W.E.B. Du Bois appears twice. I'm sure there's an objective method that led to this result, but that is precisely my point. Whose method and whose objectivity? Today, the Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall movements have focused attention on the status of Africana or Black and Brown lives. Both are anti-colonial movements, the former focusing more on civil rights in the United States and the latter on decolonizing knowledge and teaching in the academy in South Africa. The Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall campaigns didn't start with the incensed responses to the killings of Black lives in the USA or the frustrations of South African students with their educational system. Black Lives Matter movements under different names have been a feature of anti-slavery, anti-colonialism, civil rights, and neo-colonialism movements. Please take a brief sidestep with me. Just days after Micah X, a Black ex-veteran, shot and killed 5 white police officers because of his frustrations over what he saw as police genocide of Black lives, on July 5th, 2016, Alton Sterling, a 37-year-old Black man, was shot several times after being tackled to the ground by 2 white Baton Rouge police officers. The police were purportedly responding to a call that a man dressed in red and selling CDs and cell phones was trying to rob somebody. As is normal these days, the shooting was captured on multiple cell phones. You have the shot up there. The very next day, on July 6, 2016, Philando Castile was fatally shot by a police officer after being pulled over. Initial reports were that he had a damaged tail light. It is now not clear why he had been pulled over. And interestingly, there's another story that has followed this, because the owner of the convenience store where Castile was arrested has filed suing the police, because he says that he was maltreated, he was not allowed to use the bathroom because the police wanted to see the video coverage from his shop, and he was forced, in addition to all of that, to relieve himself outside in front of police officers after having been denied to use the restroom in his own convenience store. The response, all lives matter, and this is a very humorous attempt at showing the problematic around all lives matter. The response, all lives matter, which of course all lives do matter, nobody would argue with that, reflects many things, among them a failure to understand and contextualize the status of Black lives today, both in the US and elsewhere, and that by repeating this notion that all lives matter, one actually asserts that some lives do matter less. The failure to appreciate this is not only the fault of inaccurate media portrayals, but also social science research. The questions asked and not asked, the methods and conclusions, and of course, whose research reaches the media. What has been interesting for me recently as a sociologist are the number of studies emerging that claim either no evidence of differences in police shootings by race in the US, or showing how many white deaths result from police shootings, or crime among Black communities that leads to the death of Black people. Forget small studies, forget failure to analyze by population size, and God forbid that these studies should make even a vague attempt to contextualize the US brutal slave history, and that not too long ago, law enforcement officers even belonged to the KKK. To make my case for the relationship between knowledge production, its valorization, and the status of African lives, allow me to very briefly share two examples from the development literature. We've critiqued development and how it has been used, and how it sometimes erroneously leads to policy decisions, but this still goes on. And in the area of population policy, we still have good people and bad people, good and bad countries. Typically, the women on the continent are not making use of the methods that have been made available to them. They are still having unwanted children, but if you came to a community, a small community in Ghana, and you asked a woman, how many children do you want? And she says, 4. And how many children do you have? 6. And so 2 children are unwanted. It doesn't make any conceptual sense, because children are wanted and children are a gift from God. Programmatic priorities still follow this kind of, the population discourse that has seen a resurgence in the last couple of years. 2 German companies, Bayer and Helm Medical, belong to UNFPA's biggest suppliers. When combining Bayer Oy, based in Finland and producer of the implant Jadel, Bayer Healthcare, based in Berlin, and who markets Jadel, and Bayer SA in Ecuador, Bayer was by far the company with the largest delivery volume in monetary terms in 2012 and 2013. So obviously, if you have certain studies, certain conclusions, and certain people funding your studies, you're going to have a big market. But the value of children is not about costs and benefits, but about the continuation of the lineage. The other example I have has to do with the notion of democracy, and how that is problematic for many of the ways in which we understand the institution of politics on the continent. I will skip that and quote here from Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, and who insisted that we establish a Center of African Studies as a pragmatic way of bringing African knowledge into what was essentially a European type of university. And this is the charge that he gave to us when the institute was opened in 1962. One essential function of this institute must surely be to study the history, culture, and institutions, languages, and arts of Ghana and Africa in new African-centered ways, in entire freedom from the propositions and presuppositions of the colonial epoch, and from the distortions of those professors and lecturers who continue to make European studies of Africa the basis of this new assessment. So he just reflects a lot of the thinking that was valid at the time and that continues to find salience. I'll conclude by giving two examples from, or three actually, from understandings of our humanity in Akan tradition. And do I have that slide? Okay, this, in democracy, I skipped this, but very quickly, let me insert this. In democracy, and when you're thinking of failed states, there's a failed states index, and you can see that most of the failed states are in the global south, purportedly. These three symbols, Boame Namen Boao, Nkonkonsum and Mridane, are Adinkra symbols used in Akan to show the connectedness of humans. So, for example, rich people don't refuse to accept a gift from the poor, because Mridane means times change. If you were to refuse to accept a gift from someone you thought was poorer than you, you would be implying, one, that you will never need help, you will never be in a state of dependency. Nkoso suggests that we are bound together, and Boamenamemboao means help me and let me help you. I conclude by saying that Mesaba, literally I will return, and going back to the Sankofa bird that we had at the beginning, is the title of a hip life song by a duo, Achiame, the plural of Ochiame. Achiame, or Ochiame, has been translated as a linguist, the linguist of the one who speaks on behalf of the chief. But really, this is an advisor, an ambassador, a counselor. And a young group of musicians have used these titles in their music to suggest that one needs to have this voice to speak to, and that this voice is not only the voice of the elderly, not only the voice of the powerful, not only the voice of those who traditionally have been known to hold knowledge. So back to my earlier point of conclusion that we want to go outside the academy, but we also want to bring in the spaces and the youth voices. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akosua. If colleagues who are sitting on the side could move maybe a bit more into the center, that would create the space for those many people who are standing in the rear to also get a seat. Let's see, that's the future we want, seats for everyone. Our next speaker is Emma PORIO. Emma PORIO is the professor and head of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Ateneo de Manila University and chair of the Governing Council of the Philippine Social Science Council. Dr. PORIO edits the Philippine Sociological Review and is president of the Institute of Development and Policy Research. PORIO represents the ISA in the Global Development Network and Asia in the Scientific Committee of the International Forum on Urban Poverty of the United Nations Center for Human Settlements, also known as Habitat. For over 2 decades, Dr. PORIO has done extensive research on children, urban poverty, gender, and governance. She has served as a consultant to the World Bank, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, Asian Development Bank, United States Agency for International Development, and UN agencies such as UNICEF, UNDP, UNFPA, ILO, and WHO. She has written several books, including Partnership with the Poor, Pathways to Decentralization, Urban Children in Distress, and Urban Governments and Poverty Alleviation in Southeast Asia. The title of her talk is Risks and Resilience in a Rapidly Unfolding World. What does it hold for our sociological practice? Let us welcome Emma PORIO.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, fellow social scientists. And thank you so much for your patience, your generosity, being here despite the heat, the rain, the humidity, and the cold. We still survive going to all the sessions. I would like to thank the local organizing committee for organizing such a splendid conference here in this hallowed halls, 650 years of intellectual heritage. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Rodolph Richter, and and all the workers, intellectual workers that are supporting. Thank you so much. And also, I'd like to thank Markus Schultz for organizing this panel, and to Isabella Barlenska for, she runs the ISA. And also to the research councils for organizing such wonderful panels. And most of all, I'd like to thank Professor Margaret for leading this organization excellently. So the title, I think I changed. Can you please remove my image? No, the slides are the stars. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll go fast. I have plenty of pictures for you, but the title of my talk is Climate, Disaster Risk, Resilience in an Upland. What does it hold for us? I would like to basically, what happened? Okay, these are the basis of my talk this evening. I've been doing climate change for the last 10 years, but one basically is the coastal cities at risk, that I'm doing it with in Manila, Bangkok, Lagos, and Vancouver. But the one that I really like was my work in Red Hook, Brooklyn last year on a Fulbright. I like this because Global North always studies Global South. And this one, I was able to reverse basically the model. And I'd really like to thank Michael Borowoy for linking me to the students of Rolf Milkman who were in Occupy Sunday and became an Occupy Red Hook. By the way, Red Hook used to be the unsafe neighborhood in 1992. I don't know whether Donald Trump knows that. But, and I also would like to thank Margaret for hosting me at Hofstra. And for me, the experience transformed me, and it also transformed Fulbright. They realized that third world people can do research in first world countries. So I think I was the first one to do that. So anyway, I'd like to also, for the last 10 years, I've been working collaboratively with scientists, geomatic specialists, hydrologists, and all those people who tell us what the world, the geophysical world at risk is all about. So these are my messages. Number one, for me, the climate disaster risk, it challenges our vision of societal progress. It pushes us to question our consumption-driven lifestyles and the values that support our unsustainable. Am I making, can you hear me? Yes. Oh, okay. I cannot hear myself, anyway. For me, climate disasters, it forces us to look, what are we doing to the earth? Why are we buying so many of these stupid goods, manufacturing all these things, extracting it from the environment and make it our relationship unsustainable? It also pushes us to question the values that support all these inequitable systems that every day, the social hierarchies that we live and sometimes reinforce and sometimes we erode. It also allows us to look the policies that privilege the extractive economies that ruin our environments and erodes our community values. It also forces us to question the governance systems that privilege the needs, our needs now of this generation, heedless of the needs of the future generation. So for me, studying climate change and looking at it, it forces us to think that we have to look at our beyond, the social, ecological, political, and development frameworks of our analysis. It demands that we must recast the decision-making frameworks and governance systems, our discipline-based concepts and methods that are bounded in space and place, nations and regions. But as I always tell people in Manila and Asia Pacific, water and flood and winds do not recognize your political and economic boundaries. It will come. It does not say, oh, okay, the flood now will slow down because I have an authoritarian local government here. So we have to think about the ways we're doing our studies. I would like in this the study propose a systems thinking in climate risk analysis and institutional arrangements. I want to propose a systems dynamic approach that intersects with social science analysis that is problem-focused, inter- and transdisciplinary, and systems-oriented approach. Yesterday, Radio Austria interviewed me and asked, so after doing my work, he says, is the ivory tower social science a thing of the past? Then I said, I don't know. Maybe these men here in the hallways knew their ivory towers. You know these men there? I was thinking, I think they have their ivory towers. But back home, I said, I cannot afford to have our ivory tower. We have to address the problem. Our knowledge production and knowledge mobilization must address the questions and issues of the day. I told her that, but after a while, I thought to myself, I do come from an elite institution. And in some way, there is some ivory tower there, but I told her, no, a lot of the time, we have to get our feet wet. So let me just digress a bit to the global, regional, national scenarios that shape my work in Ateneo de Manila and Jerusalem. The Philippines is number 2 at risk in the Global Risk Index. 8 of the 15 top at-risk countries is in Asia Pacific. Also, if you look at it in terms of the exposure, I mean, with all our development progress, we have made the world highly at risk, exposed to, very vulnerable. And also, you look at your regions, okay? Whether you're vulnerable or look at Europe, very green, and North America. And so highly vulnerable and the urban risk. And then the Global Risk Index of 2015, you'll see that political, economic, and ecological risks are highly connected. If you look at Asia and the Pacific, our risks are failure of the governance and planning and man-made environmental catastrophes and interstate conflict. Southeast Asia, you can see, we're all red, you know, and our index of climate vulnerability is very high. The region is also, in terms of cost of disasters worldwide, top the stars. And so I always tell people back home that with these climate disasters, we have to basically understand vulnerability and building adaptive capacity and resilience of cities within the democratic and decentralization nexus. Because the ones that craft climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction plans are the local government, but they do not have the capacity. Also, we have to figure out the global local interfaces of capitalist development and expansion. And with all these disasters, there's a new word called disaster capitalism. After disaster, a lot of the business are done by the private sector and humanitarian agencies, if you think about that. And so we have to think of this context, and within that also, the rising prosperity and inequality in Asia is something to be worried about. Now, this is Metro Manila in terms of governance. Metro Manila has 12 million people according to the census, but actually it has around 16 to 18 million daytime population, and if you include the periphery, 25 million. When I was studying urban sociology, they say the carrying capacity of the city is only 5 million. So you can see. So it's below sea level, 40 to 50% do not have security of tenure, and it accounts for 37% of the GDP, and basically it's urban economic primacy, while its strength is also very much a weakness. Can you imagine? There is an earthquake fault running across the city, and we're expecting the big one. Can you imagine? You put all your investments in there, and one big earthquake can destroy it. So the other thing about governance systems, highly decentralized, democratized, but very fragmented. 17 city chieftains wanting to rule each other. So metropolitan governance is almost absent. This is in 2009, we have Kitsana. 1 month rain fell in 6 hours and wrought so much damage. The second one is Haiyan. If you can see there, it's a perfect storm, 600 megawatt. You can see the Philippines, the green one. You can see, and it it affected 13.2 million and so much damage. So what we're basically saying is that we have to think systems-wise, and in my work, we want to produce knowledge base of coastal cities that will support policymakers, private sector, and most importantly, the vulnerable communities. And we basically think that we can understand adaptation and resilience by looking at it in interconnected phases. And we take an interdisciplinary approach involving natural, engineering, social, political, economic, and health sciences. And here's an adaptation basis. But I'd focus basically in this work, we basically understand that vulnerability is prismatic. You know, the prism, it refracts because the blurring of boundaries from one source of vulnerability to the other as interacting. So it risk refracts, and we must think about the capacities of people located in different social locations. This is Metro Manila, and you can see in terms of density and 2 time periods, you can see how the geophysical basically puts the city highly at risk of coastal flooding and to inland flooding. This is tracking exposure and vulnerability over space and time. You have 1997, 2010, like that. You can see the increase of the informal settlements and commercial development. So, in a sense, the way the city has developed is really increased exposure to flooding and risk to disasters. So I'd say that in systems thinking, we should build our capacity and construct resilience that is anchored on a solid social political vulnerability analysis, science-based, context-sensitive, and including especially to the vulnerable people. You have to co-produce, co-generate the knowledge that is useful for them and their struggle for resilience. I will not go into that. But basically, in terms of analysis, we have to look at what is it for the most vulnerable? How are they affected by climate change? And I'd say that to interrogate vulnerability, adaptation, you have to look at the intersections at the macro, meso, and micro level, to look at the social, the geophysical, political, economic, and inside, you have the potentials of building adaptive capacity and resilience in different groups. I'd like to, what did I do? No, I did something terrible. Oh, these machines. Okay. Okay, you have there the map of the informal settlers. And I show this because after every flooding, the part, like last time after Kitsana, it says blast the informal settlers who are clogging the river lines. But our studies show 60% of the clogging is done by formally permitted development. When we presented this to local government, it says, oh? I said, yes, you're the one responsible for it. So this is what I say about, producing knowledge that unmask the power structures that are making this risk very risky. So I want to show this because I'd say that doing research on climate change, you have to work with the geophysical. Like here, I'm sampled, those are all the urban poor communities all over the city, divided according to 3 ecological zones and according to the river level index. So I feel that in working with this, you really have to intersect not only with your own social variables, but the other variables that make vulnerability much more interesting and intense. So what I'm basically like to say is that when you do climate change adaptation, you must recognize and analyze and act on the city's risk. The risk assessments that you do, and the exposure and vulnerability of the risk to the urban poor, and the knowing that risk is not evenly distributed. In fact, after Kitsana, so many of the houses and the cars, the insurance says we will not pay because they are acts of God. It was only later when a lot of people fought and said it's because of the failure of the city to do so that this kind of flooding. So we must recognize that the risk is not evenly distributed. We must disaggregate and differentiate according to socio-ecological systems, place, space, and I'm running out of time. So anyway, this is just to show you that by doing different levels of analysis, the levels of the characteristic of vulnerability is becomes more differentiated. I'll do that. But what I want to say is that climate disasters demobilize local communities and mobilize other structures of power. Like in this case, if you look at the first one, when I asked in 2009, how many people asked for help from the government? In 2009, a lot of them just depended on themselves. After a series of disasters, they become dependent. You can see there in the Giphy analysis I did. Also, basically what we have found is that it mobilizes the structures of powers, it mobilizes certain lines of political alignments. You can see here that the adaptation structures across, private sector, city, community, they interact and over. I will not go into that, but basically what I'd like to say is that we basically have to locate our research and our production of knowledge and how we can help it in terms of building back better. I must show you this because I work hard on making this PowerPoint. Anyway, but basically what I'd like to say is that to work is to be transdisciplinary and to have trust in each other. It's imperative that we transform our ways of thinking and conceptualizing, conscious of whose power, whose location, your knowledge that you're mobilizing is around. And then also,
just a turn, because
what happened?
No, it works. It's working.
Okay. So anyway, what I'd like to say is that I believe I want to commit in terms of making science and practice interface work better. If we do those things, I think maybe our lives will become better. We can prevent this. This is 2012, going to work in Metro Manila. Prevent this, carpooling as a news. And then more like this. And then I believe this. I want to say that in my work as a climate scientist, there is no room for intellectual machismo. I have learned basically, I have 0 minutes. I have learned basically that we have to learn to assert calmly and coolly our sociological concepts and methods and where they become important. The problem is so huge, we have to work together in order to produce a knowledge that is useful and will create sociology for a great future. I just want to quote basically that Cameron the other day was said, I was once the future. I want to ask you that in 2018 and 2022 in Melbourne, I hope you will not say, I was once the future of sociology. Thank you.
To 65, he was a leader of the student movement against nuclear weapons, a president of the SDS, the famous Students for Democratic Society, and an organizer of the first national demonstration against the Vietnam War, and the first American demonstrations against corporate aid to the apartheid regime in South Africa. The title of Todd GITLIN's talk is What Kind of World Can Weather Climate Change? Let's welcome Todd GITLIN.
I can make this happen. I believe so, yeah. I can just hit these buttons. I can use this. I want to add my boundless thanks to the organizers for including me in this rich event. I want to express my satisfaction that I get to speak after Professor PORIO, because our presentations, I think, are coming to the same reality through different angles. And in honor of the presence of Professor TOURAINE, I want to wish everyone a happy Bastille Day. Oh, I press it. That's okay. There we go. No? Okay. I called this list of considerations the obvious, by which I don't mean to say that they are simple or that everyone knows them, but I think they constitute the unignorable background for all of our considerations. The crisis is an overused word, and I think it is necessary, however, because the magnitude of the climate crisis is of every imaginable dimension. It is philosophical, it is sociological, it is political and economic, and it is embedded in the life course of a civilization, which is ours, although we live in different elements of it, different sectors of it, and from a model of development that exploits human beings and nature indistinguishably. So to get a grip on where we are historically, we have to understand that it was the extraction of fossil fuels, first coal, then oil, gas, and others, which drove the whole modern process of investment and organization and coercion and culture that we call development. It is formative. It is central. The energy that was unleashed from the remains of extinct life, which is what we call somewhat inaccurately fossil fuels, drives new waves of extinction and threatens the very civilization that gave rise to this form of development. The civilization that was given rise to by this development is now devouring itself. The viability of that development, in other words, is expiring. I want to quote from a nice piece contributed to the website that Markus SCHULZ helped organize by Mackenzie Wark. The sum total of social labor undermines its own conditions of planetary existence. There is no longer an outside, a margin, an elsewhere to dump the waste products of that labor and pretend this disorder that we make has gone away. That disorder now feeds back through the whole metabolism of the planet. It has done so for a while. It will keep doing so, in a sense, forever. There is no environment or nature that is separate. There is no ecology that could be in balance if we just withdrew from it. So we have to understand and process the feeling of living among the ruins. So another way of thinking about that is that we are survivors from two time directions. We are the lucky survivors of our ancestors who themselves survived natural, social, and other convulsions. And even the most comfortable people in the future will be the survivors of a convulsive future. In other words, the unity of humanity is two-edged. Humanity, nature. This is unnerving, but it is not entirely unprecedented. About an earlier convulsion, Albert Einstein famously said, "The release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking." I believe that it continues to be true about the currently unfolding threat to civilization, climate change. Now, in a sense, there isn't anything new. History is disruption. Disruption by conquest, by ecological threat and collapse. It's integral to human history. That didn't begin with capitalism, though capitalism being global promises vastly more sweeping destruction. Self-destruction is a human potential and not a brand new one. Tradition What we call tradition is the residue of previous disruptions. The Mayans, for example, probably fell to deforestation and drought. In the late 13th century, the villages of the North American Southwest fell to drought, which was exacerbated by warfare. The fragility of civilization is an old story, but today the scale of it is vastly magnified as human history has become intertwined, really inseparable from nature. So you say you want a revolution? Well, what does that mean? It must resemble previous revolutions in that it defeats power, in this case centrally the power of fossil fuel corporations and the government apparatuses that subsidize them. But this is not going to be like any other revolutions. What do I mean? I want to cite one of the most instructive sociologists it's been my privilege to learn from, Barrington Moore Jr., who I think has an immense amount to say about what we think of as the standard revolution. He called the old revolution, he said that the old revolutions took place by the imposition of new social arrangements, which is only possible when three conditions obtained. Number one, the old order, which was under siege, could not be reformed. Number two, the elites lost their unified control of the situation. And three, to quote him, the main factors that create a revolutionary mass are a sudden increase in hardship coming on top of quite serious deprivations, together with the breakdown of the routines of daily life, getting food, going to work, etc., that tie people to the prevailing order. And here's a cautionary note. This, by the way, was written by Moore in early 1969, when many of my American cohort thought we were already in a revolution. Moore said, even if it succeeds in taking power, a revolution that tries to remold society against the mores and folkways of the mass of the population must turn to terror and propaganda on a gigantic scale in order to stay in control. That is, from the logic of terror follows what my former teacher Michael Walzer called revolution of the saints. So, climate change has to be wrestled to the ground. This requires changes in social arrangements, but it also, not in priority to, but also alongside, changes of consciousness, changes in the prevailing way of life that is also a change in the prevailing way of revolution. And also, for the revolutionaries, the intelligence to negotiate between time horizons, between the present and the past. Climate change requires, So we have history and we have an extraordinary knowledge. Now, there are background phenomena, there are elements of human life that I think we understand reasonably well. My former colleague Richard Flax put it gingerly when he said that most people would rather make life than change history or make history. They would rather make life. In other words, most people live with a shallow time horizon, and that's workable for most purposes. For most of the things you need to do, you can do by thinking close up and small. However, it is now necessary to understand that not only is immediate life at issue, but that we're also living in the past of a posterity that may not materialize. Posterity is at risk. And those who are prepared to think that way, to understand how radical that challenge is to this civilization, must engage others who do not understand matters that way. Now, to process the experience of living among ruins, even the ruins of the future, is not a simple matter. I do not have a 12-step program or a seminar to offer about how to do this. It means to take seriously the task of rethinking and also of acting. It means to consider the stupendous complexity of the task, which is conceptual, institutional, it's systemic, as we saw in the previous diagrams. To process, however, is not simply to complicate, but also to grasp the simplicity of the task. And here I quote from a former colleague, a fellow activist, Stephen Johnson, Climate change is a function of tipping points. There's a tipping point temperature at which the melting of the Greenland ice sheet becomes irreversibly faster, which is happening. So it's not just that delay will create quantitative differences by which life becomes incrementally less comfortable. Delay creates qualitative differences that make time on Earth qualitatively more dangerous and damaging. That is, urgency is of the moment. Whoops, what happened here? Okay. At current rates of combustion and emission of greenhouse gases, we hit the danger threshold agreed upon in Paris, which was itself considered conservative by many, by 2048. In order to arrive at that result, the emission rate for the future has to be halved as soon as possible, cut in half. And 20 or 30 years after that, that is within the lifetimes of some in this room, we have to finish with fossil fuels. Finish. That's absolute. So the entire inventory of fossil fuel technologies has to be quickly replaced by climate-safe renewable energy. And too often, some of these items are left out of consideration. This means electricity, it means buildings, it means the energy industry, and it means it means all of industry, and it means transportation. All of them must be reorganized around sustainable activity. So what in particular do sociologists have to realize and do in this setting? Well, first of all, there are many things to be done as research, and we've already heard about some of them that are already done. We need close-up studies of particular regions and places and how they adapt and react and what impedes them. I want to emphasize there's one element that I think is especially important and often neglected, which is that the institutions that are accelerating this drive towards civilizational collapse are actually material and legal and political institutions. They can be studied. They involve particular relations. There are power clusters who invest in disruptive activity for the benefit of their property interests. So specific cases have to be studied. It's not just that the sea level is rising in Florida, let's say, or that the sea level is rising here or there, or that the storms are developing in a particular way, but that there can be traced, especially through the use of complex data gathering and analysis, very specific, in a way, accusations, which must be specific, they must be named, and nobody should be exempt from having fingers pointed at them for their responsibility in this unfolding disaster. Secondly, as researchers, critical sociology is not simply a form of thought that stands on an exalted plane, looks down, and deplores human crime and degradation and power relations and so on. We are in a moving civilization and in an unfolding and fluid relation to the environment. In other words, the crisis is not away, the crisis is not anticipated. The crisis is here, and so are attempts to address the crisis, whether well or not. So when there are proposals, and they are today numerous, to change the basis of production and transportation and buildings and so on to sustainable energy, we need to study how those work out. What is acceptable? What is beneficial? What is retarded? The practical activity of adaptation, mitigation, and resistance is now a social process. It needs to be studied urgently like other social processes. And as theorists, the crisis is the crisis of a global system with deep roots, that is to say, of a civilization, and there is no single path to salvation. This is both an intellectual and a political point. There is, one should be suspicious of anyone who brandishes a miracle cure. As educators, one thing we need to do is to write in the vernacular. We are attempting, if we're doing what if we're doing right, we are attempting to help society become acquainted with itself, with its powers and its weaknesses. We are in the business of trying to interpret social process to society itself. We are translators. So it won't do if we satisfy ourselves with diagrams and formulas which please us because they seem marginally more accurate or more impressive than others. We're not in the business of mapping hell, but of changing it. And so you, all of us sociologists, are human beings talking to other human beings, some of whom understand the world, many of whom understand the world in vastly different ways. And it is those human beings who hold in their hands, the levers of potential change. So communication is not a sort of afterthought for what we do. It is of the essence of what we do. So we are educators. We also need, in particular, to educate journalists, some of whom grasp what's taking place, and some of whom, for various reasons, do not or refuse to. So that is also part of our work. Our work is, because our work is in society, among human beings who are within nature, we do not look down upon these developments as if they were taking place on a distant planet. So, physics also matters. All climate is global. A life's work requires urgencies and taking urgencies seriously. And yet, it's also true that urgency can be a tyrant. And we must not succumb to the imperative of letting our fears dominate our thoughts. And I thank you.
Thanks so much, Todd GITLIN. Our commentator is Alain TOURAINE from the Ecole des Etudes en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where he had founded the Centre d'Analyse et Intervention Sociologique, the Center for Sociological Analysis and Intervention. Alain TOURAINE obviously does not need any introduction at all. He is one of the most prominent sociologists of our time. He has been awarded distinguished prizes for his lifetime work by the ISA as well as by many other organizations and countries, including the Príncipe de Asturias Prize and the inclusion in the French Legion d'Honneur. Among his most influential books are The Post-Industrial Society, Tomorrow's Social History, Classes, Conflicts and Culture in the Programmed Society of 1971, at least the English edition, The Self-Production of Society, The Voice and the Eye, an Analysis of Social Movements, Critique of Modernity, Thinking Differently. Reading just his publication titles would take up our entire time. We had earlier this week a special session devoted to his work. So let me just say that I'm particularly pleased that Professor TOURAINE had accepted the invitation to join this panel. His approach to sociology of action, to social movements and imagination was a profound influence on my own work. It had laid the groundwork for the theme we are discussing here at the forum, The Futures We Want, Global Sociology and the Struggles for a Better World. One announcement, his comments are based on only 3 of the papers that were received in advance, so therefore he will not be touching on the 4th paper that had experienced some kind of a computer trouble. Let us welcome Professor Alain TOURAINE.